In today's episode, we talk about spice, the Atreides, and a little planet called Arrakis. It's my review of DUNE, the graphic novel. Hello and welcome to PANELISM, the podcast where we talk about the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf. I'm Taylor Trask, and with me,
I'm Todd A.
I hope so. We've had a few technical hiccups, as is sometimes the case, but I think we're up and running right now on both sides. So,
and I feel like I blew my banter before the call. Like I should have told the D&D story right now.
No, because then, so Todd, just for what he's talking about, Todd gave a spiel about his D&D playing today. Had you started that now, we would be 20 minutes into this episode before even talking about today's book. So I'm glad you didn't, because I can rage talk D&D with the best of them, as we've talked about.
That's true. Episodes. This would have turned into a D&D podcast, but then we would have had 3 episodes done. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. That's all right. Well, no, this is a bit more of a classic episode in that we're just going to be talking today about one book, and going deep on that particular book, and really, kind of back to the main tagline of the show, which is the comics and graphic novels worth having on your shelf. We talked last episode. You and I both have a backlog and a TBR pile. That's we don't need to necessarily get anything new for the rest of the year, let alone the rest of the decade. And we could really go deep on a lot of books. So I think we're set for a little while.
Yeah, and I love this idea to just jump back into like talking about books, and especially with our whole theme of just like hit and reboot or redo on the whole year of 2020. Yep. No need to talk about what we're doing inside our houses. We're reading comics.
That's right. Now, I actually had a different book lined up for today's episode, and ended up, I had texted you yesterday saying, actually, let's punt that to February, because yesterday I ended up going to the comic shop for the first time in a while, and was only going to grab 1 or 2 things, which I did, but also when I was there, I got today's book, devoured it as I kind of expected I would, but in such a way that I was like, man, I got to talk about this today. So the book I did pick for today, we'll talk about in February, which is actually more fitting, I think, because it's more kind of a love story and Valentine's Day and all that. For those of you listening who want to get a head start, that book will be The World of Adina by Moebius. So look forward to that. But today I am talking about the freshly released, hot off the presses, Todd, brand spanking new book, Frank Herbert's DUNE, the graphic novel, book 1. And this is something that I'd been hearing, I heard them talking about making it or creating it. And actually, I have been reading the companion series by Boom Studios called DUNE House Atreides, which has been an ongoing series for the past couple months. Really good series, by the way. All of the covers are excellent, and it's actually hooked me pretty well. So they're on issue, I think, 3. I saw an ad for this book today at the back of issue 2. So I was like, oh, it's out. And then when I was in the shop, they just happened to have 2 copies left. I was like, you know what? Might as well. I need it on my shelf anyway, and it's another way to consume this story. And then I looked and saw that it was Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson who are adapting it. Brian Herbert, of course, is the son of Frank Herbert, who has himself gone on to write many books in the Dune universe. Some good, some questionable. The Duneverse. Yes. So Brian Herbert's involved, and then I just kind of I flipped through it to make sure the art jived with me, and it did. So I was very happy to pick this up. Go ahead.
This is an adaptation of the original novel. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and it's not, and we'll get to that in a bit. I'll talk more about the adaptation itself. Again, adapted by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, and illustrated by Raúl Allén and Patricia Martin as well. So it's a nice collaborative effort. published by Abrams Comic Arts, which I have not heard of before. I don't know if you've seen anything by them before. No. Makes me wonder if it's not either a newer publisher or one that was traditionally more focused on novels and is getting into graphic novels. This is one of those books that you would just as easily see in a Barnes and Noble as you would in your local comic shop. So it's got a lot of opportunities to be sold and marketed and all of that. The cover, yeah, Oh, go ahead.
Sorry for a sidebar so early out of the gate, but is this okay? So the Denis Villeneuve movie that's coming out, is that a remake?
Unrelated to, it's an adaptation. It's an adaptation of the original novel as well.
Right. Okay.
But this is not connected to the graphic novel. Is not in any way a book version of the film. Like they're disconnected.
Oh, so, right. But probably, like you were saying, you'll find it in big bookstores and it's obviously going to be heavily marketed and things like that. And I'm wondering if it's, just to build hype around, Dune being rebooted.
Oh, basically. I'm sure there was coordination with Legendary, who's the studio behind the Dune movie, the latest Dune movie. I'm sure there's coordination. I'm kind of glad that got delayed because this would have come out, right as that movie was hitting its stride,
right? And
probably would have created some confusion. People, thinking this is the graphic novel adaptation of the movie. It is not. So I'm glad that there is, the movie's still to come. We're living in early 21. The movie got delayed sometime this year, I'm sure. So I'm kind of glad that the graphic novel got to kind of live on its own and not be confused in the market for other adaptations that are coming or still to come. It's worth noting, too, this is the hardcover edition. I'll only be talking about the hardcover edition. I only recommend the hardcover edition, though, if you want to grab it digitally. The panels really lay out, much like many sort of cinematic stories, the panels have a really nice sort of storyboard feel, but this is one of those where I want to be a purist about the medium. If you have the original novel, great. If you have, the David Lynch movie or the sci-fi miniseries, great. But buy this physically for the fact that it is a graphic novel that really tries to use the medium to tell this particular story. So I'm going to lean heavily into that. Let me jump in real quick because I think it's like you questioned before. This is an adaptation. This is not a sort of a reinterpretation or somebody trying to put their own stamp on. This is a very loyal adaptation of the original novel. Right. And as such, they really wanted it to stand alone as a loyal adaptation that aesthetically is its own thing. Like they didn't want to try to make the costumes look like the sci-fi series or make Paul look like he was in the David Lynch movie or anything like that. There are some similarities just because the way the characters are described in the books. You have to have the way hair color is or anything like that. There's going to be some similarities, but for the most part, this is a very much a true to the spirit that Frank Herbert set out when he wrote the novel. A little history though, because I really we have to talk about the novel before we talk about the comic adaptation,
which you are a fan of, right?
I'll give you a kind of a quick history of my relationship with this series. I was in college when the sci-fi miniseries came out, and especially when Children of Dune aired. Sci-fi back in the old days in like 2000, 2001 did they did Dune as a two-parter, and it was. You can look at it now, and it's definitely a lower budget TV show, but they did a lot of things really right, and I think they took some really adventurous risks with aesthetic and costumes and what's a universal kind of space opera would look like at that point. So I like it. I'm a huge fan of Children of Dune though, which came out I think in 2003. And it's got a young James McAvoy as Leto Atreides and several Susan Sarandon's in it. It's kind of like if they did it today, it would have been a much higher quality thing, but it was kind of like at the very beginning of quality TV and people were spending money on, and taking risks. Yeah. Children of Dune was really, kind of right there and then, and itself is based on Children of Dune. And then I think a follow-up, God Emperor of Dune, which were sequels to the original story. So that's how I came into it. Eventually ended up getting the novel, liked it. And then Joe Dorowski's Dune, the documentary came out. Gave me another sort of color or context for that particular story, and I've just sort of been obsessed with it since. The fact that Denis Villeneuve is doing a movie I think is really interesting. I hated the David Lynch movie. I thought there were some interesting things, but they added weird details that nobody asked for, and just the overall, I mean, you can't really tell this story in one 90-minute chunk. It's just not. I mean, that's the biggest mistake, is trying to shoehorn everything into a 90-minute movie. I mean, they really wanted to do this right. This is a 6-part miniseries, complete, start to finish. So this, I should say too, before I jump into the history, like this particular graphic novel adaptation, I said book 1. They are doing this in 3 installments. So the book itself was split into 3 parts. The novel was split into 3 parts. And so they're taking each of those parts and just making a separate standalone graphic novel. So the next one will come out in spring of 2022. And we'll go from there. Yeah, because they have to.
You got to wait another year?
Yeah, they got to illustrate. I mean, it's a lot of work. They're putting a lot of effort in this thing. So Dune was for those of you who don't know, Dune itself was a science fiction novel by Frank Herbert. Came out in 1965. I didn't know this. I was researching. It was originally published as 2 separate serials in Analog magazine, which used to be around back then. So published in a magazine, eventually recollected in a novel form somewhere around summer of 65. As I said, there has been a history of adaptations, TV, film, books, the sci-fi miniseries, like I said, Lynch's movie, the upcoming Villeneuve movie, Jodorowsky's aborted movie. Interestingly, too, Jodorowsky's aborted movie, and for the 900th time, I highly, highly recommend everybody listening, go and watch Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary that came out in 2014. It will not only change your life, but give you a lot more context around just the story itself and what could have, what another adaptation could have been. But that movie never happened, and instead Jodorowsky and Moebius and other artists went on and made a long series of graphic novels that are sort of Dune inspired, but taken in a different way. And one of those was called The Meta Barons, which is a fantastic graphic novel series, spawned kind of its own universe of stories. And it is very similar in tone and even aesthetic to what this Dune graphic novel itself is like. So I noticed a lot of similarities, and granted, one inspired the other, but it's kind of fun to see this graphic novel adaptation not ape the thing that kind of it inspired, but sort of just the circular nature of all these adaptations is really, really cool to see.
And I know you've mentioned the Meta Barons before, and I'm sure you talked about this at the time, but when I saw that in our notes today, did not immediately realize like that was Jodorowsky and Moebius like playing in the Duneverse.
Well, Moebius didn't illustrate that one. He illustrated the Incal series, which is also heavily inspired by Dune. So the Incal, the Meta Barons, and then another book series I talked about, I just forgot the damn name.
So you say inspired by.
Yes.
But it's not.
So
they're not
what
actually
happened
in
is,
the Duneverse.
When the Jodorowsky Dune movie didn't occur, he and his team put all this effort into literally mapping out, shot by shot, the movie they were going to make. They drew all this concept art. They did all this work, and they just Jodorowsky then started to repurpose it in stories that were inspired or not part of the Dune universe, but like very much kind of inspired by the book, and then he takes it off in his own place. So the Meta Barons was a huge one of those. Incal was a huge one of those, and Moebius was one of the illustrators on the Dune movie, and then illustrated that book with him. He worked with a French or Spanish artist on Meta Barons, I forget his name, and then did the Techno Priest, which I talked about on an earlier episode too. So all 3 of those stories are part of the Jodoverse, if you will, but all heavily inspired by the characters and sort of the concepts you see in Dune itself. So, and then you could even argue Dune, not only direct adaptations and indirect adaptations, but even things like Star Wars would not have existed in the way it exists without Dune. Like, there's a lot of connective tissue in Star Wars. Even the planet of Tatooine is very heavily inspired by the desert planet of Arrakis. So you don't get a lot of popular things in contemporary culture, even Game of Thrones. A lot of the way that world is structured and the feudal families and all of that is heavily inspired by what Dune does. So it's, since it came out, it really has captured a lot of creative culture, and it was really, a lot of people have read that book and then, kind of used it in their own works as time went on. It's also worth pointing out, this is often referred to as sort of a high point in American literature. It's a sci-fi book, but it's one of those that sort of passes the sniff test for just really good, solid literature. One of the reasons for that, in my opinion, is that the story in particular really touches on themes that were relevant as hell back in the 60s, but I would argue even more so now. Things like ecology and the allegory to the Middle East and its control of oil as sort of the you can find oil in other places, but the Middle East sort of has this as a desert region, and the fact that it's so important to the economy and ecosystem, the business ecosystem of the world we live in, very, very similar. Even things like I said before too, like the Game of Thrones kind of plots and intrigue and, plans within plans within plans. A lot of that we're seeing in contemporary storytelling. Dune was sort of one of the first things that did it really well at a high level. So we take it for granted now, but this novel really set that stage, 45, 50 years ago. The story itself, I'm going to read a back of the book summary to give you a little bit of a taste for this. And this is, again, the graphic novel I'm talking about, not the original novel. It says, Dune, Frank Herbert's epic science fiction masterpiece, set in the far future amid a sprawling feudal interstellar society, tells the story of Paul Atreides as he and his family accept control of the desert planet of Arrakis, the only source of the most important and valuable substance in the cosmos. Originally published in 1965 and now faithfully adapted as a graphic novel, Dune explores the complex, multi-layered interactions of politics, religion, ecology, technology, and human emotion as the forces of the Empire confront each other for control of Arrakis. So, this is Dune I've been aware of for my entire life, and having you describe it as being like all that sort of interpersonal character drama is really interesting, because that back of the book didn't really hint at that. But so I didn't really know that. I just thought it was like, oh, this is another desert sci-fi thing like Zardoz. Well, I mean, you could mistake it for that, but I think, but it goes so much deeper.
Yeah.
Let me give you another. So it's important, and one of the things that really hooked me into just the universe that this story takes place in, is this concept called the Butlerian Jihad, and you have to kind of know. It helps if you know what that is coming into the story, because it really sets the stage nicely. So this is a universe, far, far, far in the future, populated mostly by humans. And at this point in our evolution, we let AI and technology kind of run amok and get the best of us. So at some point, it almost wipes us out. We start, as humanity across the cosmos starts to systematically overthrow AI in what's called this Butlerian Jihad, and even associated technology like calculators. Anything that's considered a thinking machine is basically outlawed and destroyed, because we never want. It's twofold that we never again want technology to sort of take advantage of humanity or control the destiny of humanity, and at the same time, there's this burgeoning desire, craving for humanity to go beyond what it currently is, to become more. And so anything that a computer used to do following the events of the Butlerian Jihad becomes almost humanity specializes to take on those tasks. So you have what are called mentats, which are human computers. So instead of like a computer or a calculator, actual people go and train to become, and they take specific drugs. There's a lot of drugs in this book, a lot of either hallucinogens or like drugs that help your brain function better. So mentats take a kind of drug that really helps accelerate their brain function, and they become sort of a human computer analog. There are other humans that there's a group of sort of, I just call them Jedi nuns called the Bene Gesserit. And they have sort of superhuman abilities. They can move, almost faster than most humans can. They can think at a high level. They can, they're very, sort of if you really take martial arts and philosophy and science and everything to its kind of fullest potential, that's what this sort of religion of of women kind of create. There's another one called the spacing. Oh, go ahead.
Were all of these like factions and things prevalent in the previous movie and like TV show?
Yes. Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
And if you know all this going in, you're not so blindsided by their introduction. You can kind of start to pay attention to how they operate and the function they serve. There's one more, and there's several groups like this, but one more to kind of note is the Spacing Guild. So, and this is probably the most important subgroup of this story. The Spacing Guild, because because you can't have AI. There can't be any kind of technology that that can navigate your starships, right? It's strangely Amish in that way. Like if you can have technology, you can have spaceships, but you can't have anything tell it what to do. So humanity, another kind of slice of humans, evolve and specialize to basically become navigators. Like they're the entities that can, through psychic means, control and navigate these starships through folded space. Now, the way they do that is through a substance called spice. Spice is only found on the planet Arrakis. So Arrakis is the key to all interstellar travel in the Universal Empire that we are introduced to. So much like the Middle East and oil, you've already sort of set up this cartel of houses that kind of jockey with each other to control Arrakis. When Dune first begins the story, one such family, the Harkonnens, have been in control. They've been really shitty to the people of Arrakis. The Emperor removes them and puts Duke Leto Atreides and his family in charge of Arrakis. So when we first open up, Paul, the main character, is packing up, getting ready to go, and we learn he and his family, they're going to Arrakis to start again, and we're just you get the sense right out of the gate there's just political intrigue and backstabbing going on like everywhere. Like imagine if every character is Peter Baelish from Game of Thrones, and you kind of have how we start Dune, just with plots within plans within plots, and you're like, who the hell do you trust? Who don't you trust? Even the characters themselves are like, I'm married to you, and I don't know if I can trust you.
I'm glad you brought it back to Game of Thrones, because there's something so amusing to me about the planet Arrakis and Duke Leo Calrissian or whatever his name is.
Oh yeah, Leto,
and then
Leto
there's just a
Atreides.
guy named Paul. That's like it's like the Kevin Lannister of Game of Thrones.
But he's the most important character. Like Paul. Well, and there's reasons, like the names. There's actually really good reasons that all the names are what they are. Like Paul's grandfather is the former Duke Paulus, and so they get a lot of kind of naming for things. But no, that's the kind of the final component to this is that because the galaxy is sort of has become kind of a universal, sort of a kind of a galactic empire of sorts. It unlike the Star Wars empire where there's sort of just one despotic leader and everybody sort of falls in line. It's much more feudal. You have these big generational family houses, and they all participate in what's called the Landsraad, which is kind of their government. And then they jockey for each other with the Emperor himself. And so Dune becomes, or rather, and Dune, I should say, is the slang name for Arrakis. So when they say Arrakis, or if they say Dune, they're talking about the same planet. And spice found on Arrakis is the most valuable substance in the universe. Without it, you can't travel, and the whole empire just falls apart. So it's very important to keep that in mind as you read this book.
As you're like recapping and talking about all those things that are good to know going in to kind of give you the lay of the land, do you think if you went in without that, does the graphic novel set it up in a pretty clear way, or would you find yourself confused?
It sets it up clearly, because it's such a loyal adaptation of the novel. One of my frustrations with the novel is that the first third really is it's a tough read. It's well written, but because there's so much like whispers and rumors, and the one thing the novel doesn't do as well as the graphic novel, in my opinion, is that you get a lot of internal monologues from every character as the novel progresses. Even the minor characters, like you hear them mutter something to themselves in their own minds. In the graphic novel, that's so much easier to both track and understand in terms of the context of what's going on. So I think if you don't have those visual aids, the novel, the purely written novel is very hard to follow for the first third. Once you get into kind of the groove and sort of the way Frank Herbert writes, it is a lot easier. And then the story shifts rather considerably in parts, in acts 2 and 3. But that first act is a little tough. So I'm glad this book 1, which follows that first act pretty loyally, it does set up a lot of the things I just described. But if you know them going in, if you're sort of captivated by the idea that this is a place in time where humanity has has really suppressed artificial intelligence and and is kind of regardless of your family loyalty or any of those kinds of things, everybody's pretty much in agreement that we can't let AI come back. Like, that's done. Like that
no
messed
more
up
calculators.
Yeah, that messed up humanity for a long time. So we're not even going to have calculators because that'll just tempt us to go right back there again. We're going to try to do this ourselves. And just to see humanity specialize in this way, like that, just knowing that going, I think it gives you a head start to just really appreciate the sort of the political intrigue more and not have to feel like you're having to figure out your way finding in the story, if that makes sense.
Right. And do you think that's like for some of that communication, is it the design elements of the book, or is it really the art style, or how are they communicating those complex ideas and relationships in the graphic novel?
Well, let's talk about the art. So,
perfect.
Like I said, this has been split into 3 sections. This is very straightforward. I mean, the thing that struck me right away as I was flipping through it, even in the store, was, this is just a very, very straightforward adaptation. Meaning they didn't try to take huge risks in making weird sci-fi, really weird, interesting sci-fi kinds of motifs. Even the colors, they use color very effectively, but it's very traditional color. They don't try, because there have been all these adaptations. I think there's a temptation to go like, well, we're going to put our stamp on this story and make it weird and cool. Yeah. And because it's Brian Herbert, it's the author's son manning the adaptation, who himself has been responsible for a lot of the Dune universe that we know. I think they were very intentional about going, this is going to honor the intention and the spirit and the word on the page from Frank himself. So everything's very clear, very focused. I think that helps you make sense of it more. And I think it is a lot clearer visually. You know where you are at any given time visually. Like, it's not confusing in that way. Like, you don't think, when they go to a different planet, it's very clear, we're on a different planet now. Or when somebody's, there's this conceit in the story, the Bene Gesserit, the Jedi nuns I mentioned earlier.
Right.
One of them is Paul's mother, Lady Jessica Atreides. And she's the concubine of the Duke, only because he, for political reasons, couldn't marry her, but she's his wife for all intents and purposes, and she's obviously Paul's mom. But she's in Bene Gesserit, and she's training Paul in their ways. One of the things that they can do, one of their sort of superpowers, is the Jedi mind trick, but they manipulate their voice in such a way to basically command somebody to do anything they want. And the way you hear it described in the novel is kind of one thing. And then you see it done in both the TV adaptation and the original 80s film adaptation. And they really kind of put a vocal effect on so that it's clear that this is like kind of almost like an unholy, inhuman voice that the person's doing. In the graphic novel, they put it in a black voice, in a black speech bubble. And that's the only thing they ever do. So it's very clear, like when they're doing the voice, that's, it's reminding me a lot of Black Monday Murders, where they kind of have that weird, like, devil speak, and it's that weird series of symbols and things. And you can almost, in your mind's eye, hear what that might sound like if it was spoken out loud. Kind of same thing. It was very easy to know, Paul's doing the voice right now. Whereas in the novel, it's a little bit clunkier to kind of figure that out if you're not ready for it.
Sure.
So I think the graphic novel does a lot to, the art does a lot to really not hold your hand, but make obvious what's happening at any given time. Like I said before, they use color very effectively, and they use it really to establish place and character and mood. When things are normal, when things are progressing, naturally. Color is also natural. Like everything is, all the characters have, their regular colors. I'm trying to think of a better way to frame that. But like when things are evil, or if there's a flashback, or you're changing planets, or things are becoming more severe, everything will have like a shade of red or a shade of blue. Like it'll be very obvious that you're being toggled between either a dream scenario or a change of scene, a change of place. Pardon me. So I really like, even though it is a very straightforward visual representation, they did take the time to make color, work in the context of the story. I do think the accuracy of the text, if you pull up the novel, this is basically the book. They're not, anywhere that they describe a scene that they can just give you the picture of and not have to say it out loud, they'll do that. So, clearly it's not word for word the book, but all the dialogue is still there. The characters who do the things they do in the book, they don't give, an action of one character to a different character just because it's the graphic novel. They're like, no, the Duke said this here. Well, he'll say it here in the graphic novel, whereas in like the TV show or the movies, like, a different character might have appeared there. They might have moved things around in the order. This is very straight. This is the novel. So if you like the novel, or if you wanted to ever read the novel, but could never get into it, this is definitely the way to get there.
Now you mentioned that in the novel, it felt like the first third is a lot of setup. Does it feel that way in the graphic novel adaptation, or are you getting an arc even in this first volume?
You're definitely getting an arc. Okay. There is clearly a lot of setup, and there's still more to come, right? I think the setup in book 1 is the political setup. I think the setup in book 2 is going to be a lot more of the religious setup, because as Paul progresses, spoilers kind of, but not really. Paul, you get the impression pretty quickly in the story that Paul, the main character, the son of Duke Leto and Lady Jessica, he is or could be a Messiah-like character to the inhabitants of Arrakis. There's the natives are called Fremen, and they live out in the desert. And I should just, in case it wasn't clear, like the whole planet's a desert planet. It's like Tatooine.
Right.
There's not there's barely any water anywhere.
It's Dune.
And so much so that when you die, if you're part of the Fremen tribes and you die, the tribe keeps your water, because the human body has so much water in it that that can nourish the tribe. They wear these things called still suits. So as you're wandering the desert, the suit can recycle your sweat and keep you hydrated, and they're very, really well efficiently designed. So the Fremen have really figured out how to make this inhospitable environment a home. And along with that, they have kind of created this religion. I should also note, one of the most important aspects of this is that Arrakis is populated by gigantic, and I mean gigantic, worms. Half a mile long, football field size worms with these crazy mouths that, all these, teeth, and can even create lightning because there's so much, sand going through their whatever, digestion or whatever it is. So anytime you see a worm on a cover of a book or associated with this, that's kind of a hugely iconic part of the story. And the Fremen treat the worms like deities. They call them Shai Halud. So the people who go there, the different families who control Arrakis, who try to mine the spice, the worms end up crashing a lot of their equipment and messing up a lot of their stuff. So the different alternating families tend to hate the worms. They think they're menaces. The Fremen treat them like, almost like Hindus treat cattle. That's sort of the Fremen way with these worms. So Paul becomes very quickly in the story sort of an intriguing character as it relates to their mythology. And then I'll just tell you now, that ramps up considerably in book 2. And then book 3 is much more kind of that third act is sort of restoring the order that comes apart in book 1. So there's definitely an arc overall, and I think book 1 is a nice setup, but leaves you with a nice cliffhanger of what's to come.
That's cool. So it's do you think these I'm trying to figure out a way to say this. Is there any possibility that the three parts of this book sort of stand on their own in that arc and story, or is it really integral, like you've got to have, not that you would read the second one without reading the first, but you know what I mean? Like, is it, when we think of traditional comic books, you might say like, oh, read the second arc of Black Science. Don't bother with the first arc or something like that.
You need to read them in order.
Okay.
Don't try to jump in on this, when the second one comes out and just try and see, like, this is absolutely, a series that needs to be consumed in that way. Like I liken it to, like HBO is doing the adaptation of His Dark Materials, which I really like. And season 2 just concluded. I would never tell anybody to just start with season 2. That's a 3-part series that you have to get in order. Otherwise it's not gonna make any sense. So Dune, even more so, because there are so many different characters, and you got to start, especially as you get into book 2 or story part 2, you really got to start tracking where everybody is, because as this war between families heats up, you need to know where everybody has been or will be, or who's aligned with who, because it kind of becomes as convoluted as Game of Thrones, right?
Right.
There are there's people what do I want to say? Like, there's traitors and deceptions upon deceptions, and triple agents and quadruple agents, and it becomes a little tricky if you're not used to that. So I couldn't even imagine coming into that without knowing the events of part 1. And
so, kind of a similar question to that. Yeah, and I figured that would be a crazy way to read it. But so a similar question is, like, at least from this first volume, do you get the sense that this really is going to stand on its own, and you don't need to be a fan of the previous movie, the new movie, or the novel to just get it? Like, will this be accessible to any sci-fi comic book fan?
I would say absolutely yes. And I would say if you have been putting off reading the novel because it's cumbersome or it's just not jiving with you, this to me is kind of the ultimate way to consume the story, because it makes it's very clear. It's loyal to the novel, so it's not like you're not getting what the novel intended. It's they were very good about mapping the novel into this as closely as they could, and the visual aids really help. My only complaint is that they didn't take more chances with trying to make a new, not a new story, but like really put their stamp on what a spaceship looks like, or what the royal the royal guards uniforms look like things like that. This is just a very standard portrayal, even to the point where I was a little surprised when they showed Arrakeen, which is the capital, the new capital city on Arrakis. The spaceport where everybody lands looks a lot like a regular airport in our day and time. It's got some extra things, but like they really the practicality of everything is much more heightened. Whereas if you take a Spectrum, I think what Jodorowsky was gonna do visually would have been at the far end of the spectrum in terms of like just really weird and out there. And you look at some of that amazing Chris Foss art that he was designing for the ships, and they're weird as hell, right? Like they're pink and yellow, and I've got one hanging in my office right now, but like they're so captivating, but it's nothing you've ever seen before. I'm going to take a stab and say, like, on the other end of the spectrum is this graphic novel, and probably the Denis Villeneuve movie, by the looks of it, is probably closer to the graphic novel in terms of, being just very straightforward, but this is probably the most straightforward. So that's my only complaint, is that they weren't more adventurous. However, the intention was, we're going to adapt this thing as loyally as we can. And if Frank has some note somewhere that says this is the color of the Duke's coat, that's the color we'll make it. Like if he didn't have a beard, then he won't have a beard. So yeah, and I totally forgot, by the way, a very crucial part of my relationship with the story actually predates the sci-fi series. There was a CD-ROM game in the early 90s called Dune that came with our very first family computer we ever got. And I loved that game because it was moody as hell. It was interesting. It gave you a taste of the story. A lot of the aesthetic was based on the David Lynch movie. So the uniforms and the costumes and everything were, even the sets were a little bit more, made to look like the movie, but it still kind of had its own thing going on. but it really kind of gave me a taste of the story too. So that said, like I kind of wanted this graphic novel to maybe feel a little bit more like that, which was like, wow, what is this? Like this feels familiar yet incredibly weird and different. And I think in the case of the graphic novel, it just felt familiar, and it's like, okay, now I'm gonna get the story. So we'll see as the story gets weirder through parts 2 and 3. It'll be curious how they, we haven't even seen the Emperor yet.
Right.
Or his daughter. There's a lot of crucial players in this whole thing. So we'll see.
The way you're describing it is like using like conventional sort of, or not conventional, but like understandable conventions of like color and other sci-fi things. It almost makes it seem like there's no way they're not aware of what Image is doing with sci-fi. So it almost feels like that must have been a really deliberate move to stay true to like an original vision of this.
Yeah.
And especially having Brian Herbert on it, must have been like, hey, let's stick to the original vision, and maybe that's just the way to make it stand out. Is like, this isn't Decorum where you need like a codex to translate what's going on in the frame. Like, this is just this is the story Frank intended, maybe.
And maybe I'm so glad you mentioned Decorum, because maybe that's what's clouding my mind of this, because Decorum is as weird and as sort of abstract as you would ever want a sci-fi story to be. Like it's always taking you by surprise. Like you can flip a page, you never know how they're going to like portray a character. It's which is kind of, when you're thinking about space and things not of this earth more and more, that's kind of where I'm craving that. And I'm heavily into reading it right now. So like maybe I kind of secretly wanted this to kind of be more like that, but at the same time, it might have made it too convoluted, right? It may have made it too inaccessible for, like you said, you would have had to have that codex to be like, okay, what am I looking at right now? What is this?
There's, to me, like, and I like talking about Hickman, like in this theoretical sense, because to me, when Hickman does like infographics and stuff, yes, they're there to kind of explain what you're looking at. Like that is the codex to what may have happened, in the previous panels or what's about to happen. But a lot of times my eye just reads it as like in situ advertising. And I look at it and I go, okay. And I just flip the page and I don't actually read those things. So I think if Dune really has those multi-layered like relationships and stuff, and you want to have that intrigue and backstabbing come through in the story, telling it straight is probably the way to do it, and not relying on a whole bunch of visual cues to track things like that, or not visual cues, but like things like infographics or, other graphic design that pulls you out of the moment. It's probably best to keep you in the moment and just tell it to you straight, True.
But as the religious philosophical side of the story starts to hold more influence, because right now it's a very political story, but it's about to become a very philosophical religious story. And so like as that happens, part of the appeal to me is creating an aesthetic that sort of almost bewilders you, to let you shift your perspective enough to take in some of the lessons that the stories, the book is trying to tell you. Like an example, kind of a comparative example, is on the Boom series, the Dune House Atreides series that's going on right now. A lot of that is very similar. It takes a few more risks, in terms of the design of the characters, and even like almost like the more dramatic angles and poses and things. But each of the covers on the House Atreides series are illustrated by Jay Lee, who I've talked about on this podcast before. I love his art. You'll recognize his art immediately if you see it. Like he's very distinct. Now, he only did the covers for Dune House Atreides. I was a little disappointed when I opened it up. I was like, oh, he just did the covers. Covers are beautiful, but it's like, imagine a Dune where he did he was the sole artist. Like, that could have been, I think that would have hit me a little deeper, because, he did, as a great example, he did the Before Watchmen Ozymandias book. Yeah. And he did it all, the cover and, all the pages and everything. And I'm a huge fan of that book. Now, one of the things that he does a lot of times is his characters are very detailed and very elaborate, and there tends to not be much set dressing. It's either a single color or, very flat shapes in shadow, or, just black and white, black and red, that kind of stuff. He really focuses a lot on the characters. And I appreciate that about them. I think that would work well for Dune. However, there is a lot of it that, the world itself is as much a character, I think. So Arrakis, you really need to see, what does the sky look like? What does the sand look like? What do the ships look like? I think that's one of the reasons the Jodorowsky version of this would have been revolutionary, because he really leaned in hard into that. And he was making a movie that was almost 100% spiritual, which would have, ultimately it would have been his version of Dune. It wouldn't have been Dune. And we ended up getting that with his, the Metabarons and all that stuff that came out. Whereas this, this visually, it's not trying to do anything artistically. It's just trying to, here's the story as a comic book, go, right? And that's fine. And again, if it's Brian Herbert involved, that's, if there's anybody who's going to have a hand in really making sure this is true to Frank's vision, I would trust Brian to do that. I know a lot of people would not, because Brian has played fast and loose with some of the Dune mythology in his books that he's written, but I still think he's the one who's got the best eye towards what his dad would have wanted. Yeah.
Well, and you said, just to reiterate this, and you said it at the top though, digital or print?
Oh, absolutely print, absolutely hardcover. Again, a lot of these panels function very much like storyboards, but there is something about the size of the book it's a really good size. The paper is thick, really sturdy paper. The smell of this thing, Todd, oh my God, the smell of this thing is intoxicating. I'm not kidding. You open this up, and it smells like
such a physical book.
I mean, it smells like a comic shop. It's just injected in your nose directly. Every page turn is I'm even doing it right now, getting almost like a contact high from this thing. So the physical, I think, because it's based on a novel, and because it's they're really trying to make comics, make the comics medium, make the story work. I think you got to get it physically. And I would even say go to your local comic book shop and pick it up, because most of them are carrying it. And it's just a great purchase to support your local shops. I know a lot of times I do say, especially with the more cinematic books, that Comixology or specifically Cover Flow is a good way to, or Guided View rather, is a good way to consume it, and it probably would be here. But I think you're missing out by not getting the physical artifact of this thing.
Cool.
I think final thoughts. Like I said, it's the most accessible version of the story. So if you've been on the fence on whether to read it, or you're waiting for the movie to come out, grab this. I think you won't be disappointed. It'll give you the best introduction into this, and then you'll have the template, so that if you want to consume a more adventurous version of it, the David Lynch movie exists, the TV series exists, the Vanilla movie is about to exist. So you'll have other ways to have a really adventurous, kind of an artist's interpretation of this. This is the source material. I would also say too, if you buy the physical book, as pretty as the cover is, remove the dust jacket, because it really makes it feel more like a novel and not a graphic novel. The cover design is not really comics, friendly. It just looks like a great, like a Dan Brown book, but it doesn't look like a comic book. So I would take that off. The interior cover is very clean, very simple. I think that's going to sit on my shelf without the dust jacket on it. Pro tip for those of you out there, those collectors out there who are.
And it's funny because, earlier when you mentioned the next volume won't arrive till next year, I thought, oh, what a bummer. But in the way you described the novel, and this being like the most accessible version of that, it does sound like maybe it would work to read this and then jump into part 2 of the novel. So you kind of avoid Frank Herbert's lengthy explanation or confusing explanation of these things, or just use it as a primer, like a Cliff Notes for reading part 1 of the novel. Maybe that could get me into it finally.
It works incredibly well as a Cliff Notes companion. This is going to be a really weird comparison, but hear me out. It had the same effect for me as the picture Bible did when I grabbed that. Remember that they used to be infomercials on TV for the picture Bible. For those of you who don't know or were not alive at the time, some publisher took the Bible and they basically made a graphic novel version of it called the picture Bible. It's on my shelf right now. It's actually pretty amazing to give you the Bible as it takes all those stories and it makes it go, all of a sudden this is all super duper relatable because I can see, characters in context, and everything kind of, you get into it a little bit more than you would otherwise. And yeah, you lose some of the poetry, you lose a lot of the nuance. But if you were having trouble reading the Bible for any reason, the picture Bible is for you. And then much the same way, this is kind of like if Dune itself was just not resonating or you just were scared of it, grab this because it's better than whatever movies have come out to date. Again, the Denis Villeneuve movie has not come out yet, so we don't know. So it's better than that, and it will really, I think it'll jumpstart you into this world. So if you read this graphic novel and you hate it, then you're not going to like anything that's going to follow, right? This will be your sort of chance.
That's a perfect summation right there. If this doesn't connect with you, Dune isn't for you.
Exactly. I mean, because this is as accessible as it's ever going to get.
Right. And so I do have one weirdly specific technical question on this. On the cover, the letters are in these shapes that I would think are almost like circuitry, but I'm curious if that is what that is meant to portray, or if you know what it is.
I think I don't. I'm just going to assume it's a stylistic choice.
Okay.
I love the typography. I kind of wish the cover was a little less novel-y, because that typography looks really good. It's really hard to, even with the upcoming movie logo, I wasn't really into it. It's hard to make, to use the word Dune and not immediately try to find a papyrus font or something stupid that's similar. Right. So I commend that they were able to find a very unique way to represent that word that I haven't seen before.
Right. It almost looks like figures, but then I thought, no, maybe these are like circuit board kind of things. So I'm curious about it. That's always a good thing to do with the title.
Yeah. It sort of has, it's kind of got a modern sans serif vibe, but then it's got almost like ink bleed edges and things. And I'll let you know if I end up seeing that font represented in the context of the story. That could be interesting. It might. You never know. But yeah, I highly, highly recommend, we're talking this, I think for the rest of 21, this is just books worth having on your shelf. And this is absolutely one of them. Once again, Frank Herbert's Dune, the graphic novel, book 1. And I'll be talking about book 2 when it comes out sometime next year. But yeah, pick it up. It's at your comic shops. It's, if you really want to get it digitally, you can, but
it's on Comixology.
I would advise the physical version.
Yeah, and in the meantime, if you want to catch up with what we're reading for our book club, I think we're posting these in advance. We're going to try to at least follow us on Instagram at panelism.inc, and you can also go to panelism.inc to find out where to subscribe to our show. But spoiler alert, we're everywhere. So you can pretty much just search for us on your favorite podcast app, and we're there.
That's right. And we'll be back next time with another episode. Todd's book will be coming up. Do you want to give any teasers as to what you're talking about?
Sure. Yeah, actually, we teased it in the last episode, and it is going to be Eat and Love Yourself by Sweeney Boo. Well,
there you go. So look forward to that. Thanks for listening. Sir, I'll catch you on the next one.
All right. I'll see you then, or I will see you at another time.